Hello, and welcome to the May edition of the third Thursday at Hoover's. And I'm so glad you could join us this evening. I'm Jerry Flegel, President and CEO of the Hoover Presidential Foundation. And I'd like to encourage you to regularly check our website and Facebook page, as well as those of the library, the historic site, and of course your favorite public library for special program offerings that will pop up in the months ahead. In fact, we have online programs every month for you to enjoy. Next month, Professor Stephen Kuhn will present Clearing the Static, Herbert Hoover and Early Radio Regulation. And Dr. Kuhn will discuss this history and also look at how regulatory decisions made by Herbert Hoover and others still affect today's industry, including social media. Advanced registration, of course, is required for this free virtual event, and it's available online at our website or your favorite public library website. As for this program, we invite you to enter questions at any time during the program during the Q&A feature you'll find along the edge of your screen. Recent programs, we get lots of questions, in fact, more questions than we can answer. So obviously, if you would vote for those that you would like to see answered, please do so, as we'll answer as many questions as we can, but we'll do those in priority and they'll be asked first. Today's presentation is called Iowa's Communal Utopias, and it's my pleasure to welcome our newest ranger to the Hoover campus, Peter Hoehnle. Peter will be talking and providing details about specific communal groups in Iowa and a general overview of different communal movements in American history and how they influence community builders on the Iowa frontier. Peter has been widely published on American Communal Societies, including volumes on Amana and the Shakers, served as president of the Communal Studies Association, and is past editor of the journal Communal Societies. Peter, thanks again for being here and for joining us tonight. Look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. We have a lot of ground to cover because the history of Iowa Communal Societies is a long one. We're going to be focusing on the 19th century, though. This is a period when there were a lot of these different groups where people were making different choices on how they want to live their lives and how they want to structure society based on their beliefs and their convictions. So as I'm going through this presentation, please think of how you've made some decisions in your own life that reflect things that are important to you, ideals or social or political beliefs, because these people are very much like the people of the 19th century. In some ways are very much like us. They're people living their lives who made different choices in order to really lead full lives and ones that reflected their beliefs. Now, communal societies have existed in the United States since the late 17th century. The most famous ones are, you might be familiar with, are the Shakers, who are primarily in the East Coast area and actually are still around today. The Cutlerides on the Dakotas and the plains of Manitoba, the Harmony Society in Pennsylvania, the Oneida Community in New York State, which was famous for its unique marital situation. They called it complex marriage, in which all the members were married to each other. We don't have anything like that in Iowa, so don't get too excited about that. And of course, Amana, which many of you who are familiar with the Hoover site and have visited here or who live in Iowa are certainly familiar with. And that's where I come from. And certainly that's why I have had a pretty much lifelong interest, so far anyway, in communal societies. So let's get started by defining what I mean by a utopian or intentional community. First slide. So we figure there are about 260 different communal societies in the United States up until 1960. And I use the 60s as a cutoff point for that number because as some of you will be very familiar, in the 1960s and 70s, there was an explosion in communal living in the United States, so-called hippie communes. We see that today in co-housing relationships and so on today. And it just gets so broad, it's very hard to put limits on the groups you're going to study. So I'm going to be focusing mainly on communal groups that happened in Iowa in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and then a little bit into the late 19th century. There were at least a dozen communal groups or semi-communal groups in Iowa before 1900. And we continue to add to that list month by month. I've been researching this topic for about 25 years, and I can tell you I added 2 communities I'd never heard of in the last week to that list as I prepared for this talk. Next slide. I've got some characteristics that I use when I define a communal society, and you can see those listed on this slide. Communal societies are either religious or economic groups. They form because they're a new religious movement or a particular religious sect, or they have particular ideas on community living, sharing resources, and so on. The groups that are religious tend to last longer. The economic groups tend to last a very, very short period of time. They live in a compact area, in a community together. So in other words, to be a community, you have to live in a community. They're somewhat isolated from the larger society. They don't engage with the world outside. Their whole point in existence is to differentiate themselves from the larger world, to be something different. They might trade with the outside world. They might have visitors from the outside world, certainly the case at Amana, but there is still a kind of a wall around them, a little bit of isolation. They have a distinct lifestyle. Think in terms of the Amish. Now, the Amish are not technically communal, but certainly we would all say there's a distinctive lifestyle there that makes them different from the society at large. And finally, there's a size limitation. Most of these groups are very small. I mentioned the Shakers. Many of you are probably familiar with Shaker architecture and music and the Tree of Life painting and so forth. There were only ever 5,000 Shakers roughly at any given time. So they were basically the population of a small town. And yet they've had this outsized influence and image in the American popular imagination. Next slide. First community that formed in Iowa that was an intentional community was Salubria. And this is in Van Buren County, very, very close to the Missouri border. Was founded by a man named Abner Kneeland, who was a well-known Unitarian Universalist preacher in the Boston area in the 1830s. And he was a bit of a free thinker. He had been a carpenter, then he was a teacher. He married 4 times, outlived three of his wives, and had 12 children. He was well known in the intellectual community there in Massachusetts. He was a supporter of women's rights and abolition. In fact, he allowed William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist, to speak in his church when other churches in Boston would not allow it. But eventually, Kneeland became what he called a pantheist. He wasn't exactly an atheist, but he had this belief that he saw God in all things. And he also will make this statement in an article that he wrote that no individual life is, ever was, or will be eternal, which was blasphemy. And in Massachusetts at that time, you could still be tried for making blasphemous statements. And he was tried and sentenced to 60 days in jail. And people like Bronson Alcott, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Garrison, and so on, all petitioned for his release. And as you can see on this slide, there's even some publications that Kneeland will write about his case. It was very well known at the time. And it basically led him to think, I need to get out of Boston and go west. And at that point, Iowa was a territory. It was on the edge of the edge of the frontiers, we would say, or the edge of the backcountry more properly. And so Kneeland's 65 years of age. He comes west to Iowa and he invites other people who are free thinkers like himself to settle what he will call Salubria, about 2 miles from the town of Farmington. And this becomes known as the Infidel Colony, and it becomes kind of infamous among religious communities in Iowa at that time. Kneeland will build a house that is known as the Mansion of Salubria. And the funny thing about the Mansion of Salubria is it's 15 by 21 feet. So it's like a foot wider than the Hoover birthplace cottage. Not much of a mansion, but Kneeland would hold talks in this building. Basically, he dies in 1844, and that really brings an end to his little colony, which is a ghost town today. If we could have the next slide. There you see a later portrait of Kneeland. You see a picture in the lower part of your screen of the Mansion of Salubria and a grid of the community he was planning. Next slide. There's Kneeland's grave and a historical marker at Salubria. Next slide. In the 1830s and 1840s, there, of course, were a lot of pressures on American and European society caused by the Industrial Revolution. And at this point, there's a very, very eccentric man in France named Charles Foyer. And by the way, I will blissfully mispronounce names all through this talk. I apologize for that, but I have a tendency to do that. Anyway, Foyer is basically a salesman and a philosopher. He believes that we're on the edge of a new epoch of civilization. And he believes that the world can be reorganized into a group of settlements that each have 1,620 people living together in a sort of a palace in the middle of a 6,000-acre farm. And people would work together in a sort of a communal relationship, doing the jobs that they felt attracted to doing, so that they would become happy. And that ultimately, when the world was divided up into all of these phalansteries, as he called them, it would achieve sort of a state of harmony around the world. And some of his stranger ideas was Foyer would write that once the world is brought into harmony and humans are harmonious again, the ocean will become a delicious fruit drink. Lions will no longer kill other animals, and human beings will be able to grow to their full height of 9 feet and have tails, which ironically is pretty much what the characters in Avatar were like. So I always thought that, maybe there's some Foyer influence there. Anyway, some of these ideas are really kind of out there, but Foyer will meet a man from the United States, Albert Brisbane. Brisbane will just eat up these ideas of organizing society, and he will write a book that is very, very popular in the United States, Social Destiny of Man. And he will leave out the lemonade ocean and the 9 feet tall people and all this. And it will become very popular. And Horace Greeley will promote this in his newspaper, the New York Tribune, and people will go out and try to create these phalanxes. There will be 28 attempts at creating a phalanx in the United States. 12 of them last less than a year, 8 last for about 3 years, and 1 lasts for a full decade. So they don't do very well. And the movement is basically completely washed up by the 1850s. Well, it so happens that this idea comes to fruition right at the time that Iowa is opening for settlement. So a group from New York State, Watertown, New York, right on Lake Ontario, will form and they will send a delegation to Iowa to locate a site in Mahaska County, about 9 miles from Oskaloosa. and this will be called the Iowa Pioneer Phalanx. They have about 320 acres of land. Can we go to the next slide, please? There we go. There's Brisbane. You see here the two of the phalanxes that were built. Just to backtrack a little bit, the one on the left is in Ripon, Wisconsin. Ripon, Wisconsin was founded as a commune. Not a well-known fact. That building is still standing. The one on the right is the North American Phalanx in New Jersey. Next slide. So the Iowa Pioneer Phalanx will be on the Des Moines River. You can see it on the map there inside the red box. This is a very early survey map. They'll come out from New York State. They will settle. We know very little about the people who lived in this commune. We know that they had sort of a long log cabin, series of linked cabins, very similar to the two buildings in the previous slide. And we know that they basically had disagreements, and by about May of 1845, they ceased to be a phalanx, and of course there's nothing left at that site today. Next slide. This is a letter that was, literally just donated to the State Historical Society of Iowa, and it happens to have been written by the man who was the head of the Iowa Pioneer Phalanx. And it's extremely difficult to read because like a lot of pioneer letter writers, he was actually writing over his sentences in different colors of ink and so on. But it's a very valuable letter because it gives a lot of details about how this phalanx was going to be organized. Next, please. The lady in the photograph in upper right was a member of the Norton family. She was a member of the phalanx when she was a child. The picture at lower right is of the site of the Iowa Pioneer Phalanx. Next. Another Foyer group called Garden Grove was planned for Iowa in 1848. The people had this idea of creating this colony similar to the Iowa Pioneer Phalanx. It was supposed to be in Decatur County. We don't know that it ever got beyond the planning stage. They may have shown up on site and had a picnic or something, but that's about all we know about Garden Grove. Not to be confused with the Mormon Trail community of Garden Grove, which is a different settlement. Next slide. Hopewell, this is in Clark County, Iowa. I love the article that you see on the left. Few know Hopewell was commie colony. In the 1950s and 60s, at the height of the communist, anti-communist movements in the United States, you would see articles like this that would pop up about different historic communal groups. Hopewell, we really don't know. We think they were a Foyer influence group. They go out into Clark County in basically, according to one of the county histories there, it says, every man wanted to boss his own work and do as he pleased. It was but a waste of time to try to work together. So they soon scattered on the farms of their own. And you hear that again and again in Iowa history. And in the history of communal society. So that's Hopewell, which is still a community in Southwest Iowa. Next slide. One of the more famous communal societies in Iowa among folks that study these sorts of things is Communia. Some of you may be familiar with the Elkader area. In the famous motor mill on the Turkey River. There's a picture of the motor mill there, certainly one of the most picturesque spots in Iowa. Communia was actually located very close to where that mill was built. In fact, the mill was built about the time Communia was in operation. And these were out and out, basically socialist communists that came from St. Louis. They were headed by a man named Heinrich Koch. They were obviously German. They owned about 480 acres, and it was on the Turkey River. Turkey and Volga River area. And eventually, this group comes under the attention of the kind of wild-eyed man you see in the photo there at the top of the slide. His name is Wilhelm Bitely, and he was a Swiss-born social theorist and an early proponent of communism. He actually knew Karl Marx. They didn't like each other, but he did know Karl Marx personally. Weitling, however, was more of a religious turn of mind, comes to the United States, and he organizes this workers' league in the East. He comes west to Iowa, and he winds up seeing Communia, thinks this is wonderful, this is putting my ideas into practice. He's able to take over leadership of the colony, and he completely ruins it in a matter of months. Unfortunately, by 1853, the 61 members on that tract were having personal squabbles and money problems, and they were beginning to collapse. The Communal colony will legally survive until 1864, but basically it's ending about the time that Weitling is there. There's another colony, next slide, nearby. This is the cemetery at Communia. As far as I'm aware, that is literally the only thing left at the site today. There used to be a general store in one of the community buildings, but unfortunately that burned down about 30 years ago. The gentlemen on the left are members of the Communia Turnverein. This is a social organization of local German farmers that formed in the late 19th century. Next slide, please. Just as a footnote, there's another community that's sort of related to Communia called the Liberty Colony. It's also in Clayton County. As you're going to see, Clayton County was a hotbed for communal living in the 1850s. It was very, very small. It had maybe 24 members. They were German, and they were basically communal for about a year. The Clydesdale Colony, the next one we'll cover, is actually again in Clayton County, Iowa. And it is led by a man you might have heard of named Alexander Gardner. Alexander Gardner is a sort of an entrepreneurial type in Glasgow, Scotland. And he owns a newspaper called the Glasgow Sentinel, and he's really, in favor of all these liberal reforms and so on. And he has this idea that he is going to sponsor a group of Scottish immigrants that will form a communal society in Iowa. And of course, Glasgow at that time is very poor. The tenements there are infamous. And so he gets this group of people together, includes his brother, who's the man with the rather large beard there at the right. And they formed the Clydesdale Joint Stock Agriculture and Commercial Company in 1849. And they have the stated mission: by means, and I should be doing this in a Scottish accent, but I won't, by means of the united capital and industry of its partners, a comfortable home for ourselves and their families, by following a more simple, useful, rational mode of life than is found practicable in the complex and competitive state of society from which they have become anxious to retire. Gardner lays out these very careful plans. The people migrate, they settle near Monona in Clayton County in the winter of 1850 and 51. They actually have money. They're about $25,000 and they own 800 acres of land, 12 adult male members and their families. So you figure, maybe up to 50 people there. And there's infighting again, and disagreements, and there's a wave of illness in the colony, and that leads to them disbanding in 1852 after they've been on the ground for maybe about a year and a half. Alexander Gardner will actually come to the United States to clean up the affairs of the colony. He never actually lived there. Now, reason you may have heard of him is that he will settle in the United States. He'll wind up in Washington, D.C. He becomes a camera assistant to Matthew Brady, the famous Civil War photographer. Brady and he will eventually part company, and Gardner will become a famous photographer of the American Civil War, second only to Brady in his fame. If you've ever seen photos of the Battle of Antietam, the battlefield, those are Alexander Gardner photos. He took the photograph of Abraham Lincoln that you see on this slide, one of the last portraits of Lincoln. Next slide, please. New Buda was a Hungarian colony, again in southern Iowa, in Decatur County. And this was founded by a man named Ladislaus Wihazy, who was involved in the 1848 revolution in Hungary. And that is Wihazy in the upper left corner of this slide. He had been a leader in the Hungarian Revolution, and he is named as the government, the Hungarian rebels representative to the United States. If you know much about the Hungarian Revolution, this is led by a man named Lajos Kossuth. And so he will come to the United States with these other refugees. Many of them are university trained. Many of them, like Wihazy, are nobility. And they want to create a sort of Hungarian capital in exile in Iowa, of all places. And the idea is that, they'll create this kind of utopia, and Lajos Kossuth will come over from Hungary and will locate there, and it will be sort of a launching pad for relaunching the revolution in Hungary. And they also are hoping that by being here in the United States, they'll get a lot of popular support for the revolution. They plat the town, about 75 people will live there. They have, very cultured people and so forth. And they have music and entertainment. In fact, they do everything but really put their hands to the plow. In fact, there's a local story of one of these Hungarian noblemen who actually cleared 3 acres of a cornfield using just a hoe. I mean, they just had no practical knowledge on how to do these things. Wihazy will actually just literally leave one day. He exhumes his wife's coffin, goes down to Texas and lives there. The colony is now led by a man named George Pomutz, and he makes great plans that go nowhere. And by the mid-1850s, that idea of a Hungarian utopia is passed. But there is this image of a log castle in very, very rural Decatur County, not very far from where Lamoni is now, that have been built by Wihazy and his followers. Next slide. And this is, I just love this illustration. This is incorporates some photographs of some of those early settlers. And this was in an article in the Iowan magazine about 20 years ago. Next. The Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormon Church, of course, have a strong influence in early Iowa history. Many of you may be familiar with the broad outlines of Latter-day Saint history. They're one of many religious movements that's really going to get started in the 1830s. And eventually, led by Joseph Smith, they will settle at Navu, just across the river from Montrose, Iowa. After Smith is killed by a mob in 1844, the group will schism. The main body will go west along the famous Mormon Trail through southern Iowa under the leadership of Brigham Young. There is, however, a struggle for leadership at that time, and that leads to several very small and usually very short-lived splinter groups that form little communes all over Iowa. So the photo you're seeing here right now is a sort of the site of one of the Mormon settlements that was formed as the Mormons made their way across Iowa towards Utah. They would have these little way stations along the way. Next slide, please. Before that, they had established a community known as Huehnle, which is, you could think of it as a suburb to Navu. And this is on the north side of Montrose, Iowa. You're looking at a painting of Navu. You can see the Mormon temple there at the center. This would be basically from the vantage point of Huehnle. Yeah, they're not quite communal, but there's a sort of an interdependence in the community life, and they have a lot of similarity to some of the other groups that I am covering here. So I want to include some of these early Latter-day Saint communities. So there's Huehnle, next slide, which of course is abandoned in 1846 when they make the migration to Utah. After Joseph Smith's murder, several people will claim that they are the rightful successor to his mantle of leadership. One of them is a man named James Emmett, who leads a group called the Emmett Company. And they cross over into Iowa, and James Emmett saying, I'm supposed to lead these people to the west, as Joseph Smith told me to do, and I'm supposed to minister to the Native Americans. So they set up going up the Iowa River, and they stop at what is now Marengo, Iowa, which is totally unsettled area at that point. And they camp. This is a modern aerial view of Marengo within the area, within that red square. And they stay there for about 3 months, and they actually adopt a formal communal way of life. And this is in the dead of winter of 1844-45. Eventually they get on the bad side of some of the local rowdies, and they have to migrate farther north to Hardin County, Iowa, and eventually they go as far as what's now Vermilion, South Dakota. And by that point, some emissaries sent out by Brigham Young reach them, and they're convinced to come back and join the main Mormon body. But it's very important in later Mormon history. There will actually be some towns in Utah that are organized like Orderville on a communal basis, and they will draw a lot of that tradition from the Emmett Company and other groups. Next slide, please. This, by the way, is a cabin in Hardin County. Those of you who are familiar with that area know that there's a spot known as Mormon Ridge. That's where this cabin is. It's sort of a historic landmark, and that shows you where the Mormon camp was. The other image in this slide is of the farm of the Whiting family near what is present-day South Amana. That was the trading house with the Meskwaki Indians at that time, and that's where the local rowdies congregated who went up to Marengo to make life unpleasant for the suffering Mormon exiles. Next slide, please. Another group of schismatic Latter-day Saints are going to be the Cutlerides, led by Alpheus Cutler. Photograph of Alpheus is there on that slide, as well as his gravestone. He's actually one of the 3 men who is charged with supervising the building of the Navu temple. He's the captain of the Navu Legion. He's one of Joseph Smith's pallbearers. So he actually was a kind of a leading figure. He will not disagree with Brigham Young, basically, and he will form his own little group, and they will found a semi-communal society called Manti in Monona County. He dies in 1864. His members go to Minnesota, and now they're in Independence, Missouri. And my understanding is that there are still 12 members of his particular group today. Next slide. Preparation Canyon State Park, well known in western Iowa, got its name from the colony of Preparation, founded by the man you see pictured here. He is Charles Blanchard Thompson. He calls himself Father Ephraim, and he basically believes that he is the rightful heir to the leadership of the Latter-day Saints. He receives messages through a spirit known as Benimi. And so he calls his followers Benimiites. He has virtual dictatorial control over them when they settle in this area of Preparation Canyon. He wants to start a newspaper, so he orders type. That type is put on board the steamship Arabia, which sinks in the Missouri River. And if you've ever been to Kansas City, you may have visited the steamship Arabia Museum. It was preserved. The boat sank. It was covered over with silt. It was excavated. The artifacts from that wreck are on display in a museum in Kansas City, including the type that was intended for the Preparation Colony. And you see that in the middle photo, still in its original crate with Thompson's name on it. Eventually, his followers revolt because he's being such a terrible dictator. In 1856, they literally chase him across the prairie. I have this wonderful image of these followers carrying pitchforks and chasing this man running away. He eventually goes to Philadelphia, where he dies many years later. The court divides the property, and the colony just ceases to exist. Next slide. Another important Latter-day Saint leader, Sidney Rigdon, again, a claimant to the leadership role, will have some followers. In 1864, these folks who call themselves the Church of Jesus Christ of the Children of Zion will settle near Attica in Marion County, Iowa. Rigdon actually never visits this colony, but he leads it. He issues revelations from God that are sent to his agent, a man named Stephen Post, the happy-looking man you see there on the right, and he will direct the colony that way. Of course, eventually, Rigdon dies. His followers go up into Canada, and that movement kind of falls apart. Next slide. The Jasper Colony, not to take too much time, but Emmanuel Swedenborg was a famous religious spiritualist figure in the 18th century. He was from Sweden, lived in London. He wrote book after book of revelations, and his followers founded what was known as the New Church, or the Swedenborg Church. Some well-known members of that church have been Johnny Appleseed and Helen Keller, and it still has many thousand members today. Anyway, some Germans from St. Louis, under the leadership of a man named Heinrich Hoehnle, Swedenborg followers, they decide to form a colony in Iowa County and near Amana, actually. And they're communal for 2 years. Next slide, please. There's a map here of the Jasper Colony site. They call it Jasper. You can see where the colony cemetery is, their schoolhouse, and the church. This is a little replica of the colony's common buildings that was made by a descendant. They'll be communal for 2 years, and then they think, you know, we really don't need to be communal. Let's have our own farms. And so they'll basically go on farming in this area, and their descendants are still there. The Utah family, very prominent family in Benton County, descends from them. And they still have a reunion every year at the Swedenborg Church. The congregation actually will last until the 1950s, but they're no longer communal. The odd thing about them is they're only about 3 miles away from the Amana Colonies, which form about 4 years after the Jasper Colony. And so, you know, they're almost in the same place, and they have some relationships between the different people. Next, please. And this is the church. It's literally the most picturesque country church you're likely to find anywhere in Iowa today. And it is literally in the middle of the country, about 4 miles north of High Amana. Next slide. The next communal group we'll cover is much better known. These are the Icarians. They are followers of a French utopian socialist named Etienne Cabet, who probably pronounced his name differently than that. Cabet is a newspaper publisher and a radical. He eventually is exiled from France. He lives in London. And while he's there, he decides, well, why not write a novel? So he writes a utopian novel about this fictional English lord who goes and visits this wonderful island nation called Icaria. And everything is just wonderful in Icaria. And they have technology that does all the work, and people only work for a few hours every day. And they have parks and theaters, and folks are able to just have this wonderful life. And he publishes the book. And of course, people in France just really fall in love with this idea of Icaria and this idea of a utopia. And so they clamor for Cabet as their leader to actually found this colony. And Cabet decides to send a committee to Texas. And they found a colony down there that is a complete disaster. One of the they all get sick. One member is actually struck dead by lightning. They go to New Orleans, regroup, and then they go upriver to Navu, where the Mormons had been. The Mormon Church had been pushed out by this time. So Navu is available, and Cabet creates his little Icarian colony there, and it goes pretty well for 5 or 6 years. But like a lot of these communal leaders, he becomes a dictator, and eventually his own colony throws him out. And they don't chase him across the prairie like Thompson, but he and his loyalists go down to St. Louis and found a short-lived colony there. The rest of the people go west to Adams County, Iowa, and they try to recreate Icaria there in rural western Iowa. And oh dear, I hope some of this can be heard. So anyway, they go out there and they establish their colony with less than 100 people, and they live communally for about 20 years. Then there quarrels, they split, they form 2 new colonies. Branches of this movement will continue living communally up until 1898. And they are in existence for over 50 years. They're the longest lived non-religious communal society in American history up to that time. Next slide. I hope. These are some paintings of some of the early colonies. This is the Icarian settlement at Navu. The ruins at the middle of this picture are of the Mormon temple, which of course has since been reconstructed. Next slide. This is a drawing of Icaria in Adams County in the 1870s. Next slide. Well, it's a diagram of the colony. It's probably pretty hard to read on this slide. So let's go on to the next slide, please. The Icarian descendants in the Corning area have really done an amazing job in preserving the story of the Icarian colony. What you're looking at here is a photograph of the Icarian refectory, which is sort of like their dining hall in library building, and their schoolhouse. And this has since been restored. This is in the process of being restored when I took this picture. But you can actually go there and visit this and see where this colony was located. Next slide. Next slide. They had a newspaper. This is actually a picture of the entire Icarian community at the very end, about 1890. What basically happens is they hold their annual meeting. Nobody wants to be president of the colony anymore. And they say, you know, we're getting older. Let's just divide it up and call it good. And so they basically divide the assets and cease to be communal. But other than Amana, that is the longest lived of the utopian colonies in Iowa. Now to Amana. I joked with my supervisor that screen was going to fall in the middle of my presentation, and it has. Okay, let's move to the next slide, please. These are some more pictures of Icaria. Next slide. You don't always think of Catholic religious orders as being communal, but they have many of the same attributes of communal societies. They aren't usually included in books about communal groups because people just kind of assume that the Catholic Church supports them, but really they tend to be self-supporting institutions. And of course, in Iowa, we have several religious orders. The oldest is Our Lady of New Mallory, Cistercians of the Trappist Order, which has been in Dubuque County since 1849 and has about the most beautiful chapel I've ever been in, as you can see in that photograph there on the left. Next slide. Okay, Amana. Well, Amana has a very long history, way outside the scope of this talk, but I had to include it because this is an overview of Iowa Communal Societies. The Amana Society is created by members of a religious sect known as the Community of True Inspiration that come from Germany. They are in some ways Quakers in a lot of their beliefs. There's an emphasis on simplicity. There's an emphasis on a personal religious conversion experience and a belief in inspiration. In other words, that the Holy Spirit could inspire people to proclaim God's word. Now, in the Quaker tradition, of course, that's a more universal gift. In the inspirationist belief, it's focused on certain specific individuals who are known as instruments or Werkzeuge. In the Iowa period of the inspirationist community, there were two. One was named Barbara Heinemann Landmann, and the other, the more well-known one, is Christian Metz, who was the leader of the group for about 50 years. They come to the United States in the 1840s. They first settle near Buffalo, New York. Buffalo becomes this booming metropolis in the 1840s and 50s. Lots of worldly temptations for the young people. So they sent committees to look for land in the West. They ultimately settle on 26,000 acres of land in Iowa County, Iowa, about 35 miles from West Branch. Next slide, please. 7 villages, total of 1,813 members at their height. As I said, 26,000 acres of land. Mainly farming goes on in these colonies. People eat in communal kitchens. They live in sort of apartment houses where several different families, sometimes relatives of an extended family, but more often just several different family units will live together. They attend 11 church services every week. They have some industry. They make the famous Amana indigo blue prints or calico prints. They have the woolen mill in all these little craft shops that you need to keep a little town afloat in those days. And they will be highly successful. In 1900, they are the largest communal society in the world, the largest single site utopian colony ever in the United States. There were 22 Shaker communities, but altogether, the land of those communities doesn't equal the 26,000 acres of the Amana Society. So very, very successful up until a point. Like all these other communities, there just came a time when the folks realized that communal living had too many drawbacks. It had provided them with security. It had allowed them to practice their unique religion in isolation for the most part. But at the same time, as you get into the second and third generation of members, the children don't want to live communally like their parents. They want to have all those nice things that they know folks on the outside world have, like cars, play baseball, wear fashionable clothes, earn some money. So young people begin leaving. And then, of course, Iowa goes into this agricultural depression in the 1920s, which only becomes worse when the rest of the country enters the Great Depression in the early 30s. And so the Amana Society gets to a point where they are literally going to go bankrupt because they're paying for all of these hired workers to do the jobs that their own people won't do anymore and so on. And the economy is terrible. Nobody's buying woolens. And so they reorganized into a joint stock corporation, and everybody's given shares of stock in proportion to the years of service. And as some of you are aware, the Amana Society Corporation continues to this day, largely with shareholders that are descendants of the original communal members. The church continues today, again, largely with descendants of the original members, but still very active. Actually, if you want to watch a service, we're on Facebook Live on Sundays at 10 o'clock. So certainly adapting to the times, much as the leaders did in 1932 when they reorganized. So Amana, definitely the best known of the Iowa Communal Societies, but as I hope I've shown here, by far not the only one. So we've seen this long train of different little communities, most of them unsuccessful in the long term, but successful in the one sense that they allowed ordinary people of that era to express themselves, to live out their ideals. There may not be ideals that we would agree with necessarily, but certainly you can admire folks for taking that initiative to really put themselves behind the things that they believe in and that they hold dear. So they're a unique part of Iowa's colorful history, kind of a blip on the screen in some ways, but certainly part of the Iowa story. And in the case of Amana, and to a certain extent of Icaria, still a visible part of the Iowa landscape today. I think there might be one or two more slides here. Nope. Thank you very much. I understand there were some sound issues, so hopefully most of you were able to hear that though.
Well, thank you, Peter. Yeah, it's unfortunate, you know, with technology, you never know on there, but I know we had one person that had problems, but I know both Brad and I here, and we had a couple others chime in that it was good. So hopefully it wasn't widespread anyway. So so we had a lot of listeners on, got a few questions, and we got about 9 minutes left. So so first question I got on there here is, do contemporary groups, say such as country clubs and neighborhood associations, have much, if any, in common with the desires, goals, et cetera, of communal societies? And also given New Buddha, was there ever a new pest? Thank you for the presentation.
I love it. Nope, just New Buddha. There's still New Buddha Township. It's on the very border with Missouri. The Federation of Communal Cooperative Societies and so on nowadays, they have such a broad definition. I have a friend that has spent its 50-year career as a scholar compiling this exhaustive list of every American commune, and he quit because he said if you use that broad a definition, your average trailer park, you know, it's a group of people, they're in an isolated area, they have some things in common and so on, they will count. So, you know, on the list I presented, I'm kind of selective. I follow the groups that interest me, and I felt illustrated kind of the broad outlines of communal history.
Oh, great. The question is, how did you initially get interested in communal societies, so forth like that? And obviously, you know, and I you know, we saw that you were president of an organization, so forth like that, but you have vast knowledge in Iowa of that. What piqued your interest to start with?
Well, as I say, I'm a lifelong Amana resident so far, and the generation, the product of generations of careful inbreeding. No, I was in the Amana Colonies. My mom was worked at the museum. My grandfather, my great-grandfather were actually historians, and it was just natural. We had all these papers at home. I grew up with people that had, I mean, all my grandparents lived in the communal system. So I had that story firsthand. The Communal Studies Association is a loose group of about 300 members from all over the United States. We have an annual conference. It's usually the first weekend in October. It'll be virtual this year. And I just kind of got roped into that. it was, this came naturally. I went to Iowa State. I studied under Dr. Dorothy Schweeder. Some of you may be familiar with her. She was a student of the Hutterites and the Amish, and she encouraged me to do my Amana research, and one thing led to another, and I fell down that rabbit hole.
Well, very good, very good. Well, Steve Kuhn asked a question early on the chat. If communal groups continue to be founded today, are the motivations the same as in the past, given that early communes were economic or religious based?
Yes. Yeah. So you'll see like co-housing, which would be people living in an urban area like college students. That's an economic, a shared relationship. Sometimes people are like affinity groups that just have similar ideas, will come together. A lot of the groups, like there's a group in Southern Iowa called the Essenes. I didn't cover the 20th century groups that are religious, sectarian groups. So yeah, a lot of them are very much the same motivations. I mean, this thread is all the way through American history.
Okay. Well, Carol writes, the LDS sites you discuss, are there locations near or along the Mormon Pioneer National Historic Trail?
Yes. Hoehnle is in Montrose, and that trail really, the first markers for that trail are in Navu and then in Montrose going west. The Emmett Company site is in Marengo, and it is on an audio tour for the Iowa Valley Scenic Byway. We did that a couple years ago in a Mormon Ridge in Hardin County. Preparation Canyon, I think they do some interpretation there about that colony. And it's not that far from Council Bluffs. And of course, the trail goes through Council Bluffs.
I see. Okay. Well,
I could have just said yes.
No, that's too easy. We like the detailed answers. So, well, geographical, most seem that they're in southern Iowa that you brought up on there. I mean, there's a few scattered around. Is there a particular reason for that?
Yes, the main push for communal groups in the 19th centuries and the 1840s, that's the part of Iowa that was being settled at that time.
Okay, very good.
So
very good.
Northwest Iowa was settled post-Civil War in the 1860s and 70s.
Okay, very good. And so then we got just a couple more minutes for questions. If anybody would want to chime in, I think we've got most of them answered on there. So, I know, here's one. And I'll probably mispronounce this. Salubria seemed to be the outlier. Isn't it far northeast?
No, it's way southeast.
Okay.
It's Van Buren County.
Okay, yeah, Van Buren is down in the
and Van Buren County, I don't know if it was the economic development people down there or the historical society. Did a really nice job of putting out markers for the ghost towns of Van Buren County. It's a really neat county to visit. It's got a lot of historic buildings, and you can actually go out to the site of Salubria if you're so inclined.
Oh, okay, very good. So, well, Peter, this has just been a fascinating presentation. And for those of you that haven't had a chance to meet Peter, and of course, with the pandemic and it's been hard to get out, but now that hopefully people are getting vaccinated, and Peter often posts Facebook posts on the National Historic Site, the Hoover National Historic Site Facebook. And if you're not following that, I would really encourage you to, because he's got some great items on there. Some are local West Branch, some are about Herbert Hoover and family. And I just find it fascinating and interesting on that. So, Peter, I could say we're going to watch it back, because you've got a lot of different topics that obviously you've researched and can speak well on. So
I saw the question from Steve Kuhns there, and the next research topic, it's Jesse Hoover.
Okay, very good. Well, so maybe I should ask this question because it came up today with Jesse Hoover. I'm gonna veer off on this. And of course, he had a blacksmith shop, and then in essence, I think he either sold it or got into selling implements. Didn't he, before he passed away? Do you know, was there any particular brands of implements that he was selling?
Victor sewing machines.
Victor sewing machines.
That I know. And his father had a patent on a pump and he sold water pumps. And if you're familiar with the gazebo at Heritage Square in West Branch, the first pump, I just found this out because I read the town council minutes. The first pump in that gazebo was a Jesse Hoover pump, which he sold him for $5. And the sewing machine that is in the Hoover birthplace cottage, which we think it is actually is Huldah's sewing machine, is a Victor.
Wow, interesting, interesting. Well, we do have one last question came in. It's from Carrie. Would you consider MUM in Jefferson County to be a communal society? M-U-M.
Gosh, I don't know anything about it. That would be interesting. Could you email me about this?
Yeah. So if you want to email Peter or email us and we'll pass it on. But I can guarantee you now, Peter's going to be researching that one.
Oh yeah. Well, that Attica, the Rigdonite community, that's the one I just found out about. And so yeah, the list is forever growing. And you go into the 20th century, Vedic City in Fairfield, the Lawsonian community in Des Moines. There are a lot of other groups to study. So another project I have, and is I actually am working on a short book about Iowa communities and a book about Wilhelm Bitely. So there's always something going on.
Well, very good. Well, and again, thank you so much. If you'd ever, like you said, you're in West Branch, and Peter is the newest park ranger, although there's going to be some newer ones coming on. They would love to visit with you, and they're just a wealth of source of information on Herbert Hoover and the historic site. But as you can see, Peter's got outside expertise and knowledge as well. So always just another reason to come to West Branch. So again, Peter, thank you so much for the presentation. It was wonderful, and we will be having you back again.
Thanks.
So, okay.
Bye, everybody.
Well, very good. So now that's all the time we have for questions now. And of course, I'd like to thank Ranger Peter for joining us tonight for this excellent presentation. And I'd also like to thank the Herbert Hoover National Historic Site and all of the public libraries who helped make tonight's program a success. And I'd encourage you to come visit the Hoover campus and enjoy a walk around the park and explore the historic buildings as the temperatures are beginning to come back up and the flowers are starting to bloom. And I think they're pulling the machinery equipment out basically this week. So they're pretty much done with the stormwater retention project, and it really looks nice on there. And so you need to come down and visit. You know, for now, the Presidential Library is still remaining closed to the public. The historic site, of course, is pleased to welcome back visitors, and the visitor center is open, as I mentioned on that. So again, it's just a wonderful time to come in the spring on there. And it's ironic, usually most springs were filled with school buses, but the schools aren't doing school trips this year. Hopefully we'll be getting them back either this fall or next spring on that. So again, it's a great time to come. Just a reminder, the Hoover Presidential Foundation staff is at work, and we're ready to assist you with any membership needs that you have or charitable gifts in support of the Hoover campus. And on behalf of all of us here at the Hoover campus and the participating public libraries, we thank you for joining us tonight, and we look forward to your next visit here at the Hoover campus. Have a wonderful evening.